Before we begin, I need you to tell me, when the others were gone and you realized you were truly alone out there, what kept you moving?
When the last of them was gone, the silence felt heavier than the cold. Nights were the longest. Sometimes it felt like the dark was trying to swallow me whole.
The world didn't end with a scream or an explosion. It ended with the fading thrum of a diesel engine. That rhythmic vibration in the chest, the only tether to the living world, simply ceased, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like pressure building behind the eardrums. Ada stood on the gray shingle of the beach, her boots sinking into gravel that felt less like earth and more like ground bone. She watched the relief ship, the Silver Wave, become nothing more than a smudge of charcoal against a sky that looked like a bruised lung. The vessel didn't just sail away. It was digested by the horizon, swallowed whole by a wall of necrotic fog that rolled off the Arctic Ocean. The cold here was not merely a temperature. It was a physical assault, an invisible weight that pressed against the lungs. It tasted of wet iron and ancient ice, a metallic tang that coated the back of the throat and made every inhalation a conscious battle against the reflex to gag. The wind didn't blow, it scoured. It sought out the microscopic seams in her parka, the gaps between scarf and skin, probing for warmth like a wolf testing a fence line. Ada huddled deeper into her furs, feeling the terrifying insignificance of her own body against the vast, indifferent architecture of the tundra. Beside her, the four men stood like statues of false confidence. Crawford, Knight, Maurer, Gal. They were gesturing at the vanishing ship, their laughter snatched away by the gale before the sound could fully form. They saw an empire to be claimed, a British flag to be planted in the permafrost to claim glory for the crown. They saw a grave. They were four hardened explorers with rifles and theories. She was a seamstress with a sewing kit and a dread that had settled in her stomach like a stone. She looked at their hands, raw and red, and wondered how long it would be before the frost turned them black. The fog bank lurched forward, erasing the sea entirely. Now there was only the island. The silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the hiss of the surf clawing at the frozen stones. It was a quiet that commanded attention, a void that demanded to be filled with fear. Ada looked down at her boots. A single flake of snow drifted down from the leaden sky, landing on the dark leather. Then another, and another. She watched the flake for a long moment, waiting for it to dissolve into a droplet of water, waiting for the warmth of the earth to reclaim it. It did not melt. The passage of time on Wrangel Island was not measured in hours or days, but in the slow, agonizing subtraction of hope. 3 months had dissolved into the gray slurry of the Arctic winter, and the enemy was no longer just the wind that flayed the skin. It was something blooming within the blood itself. The canvas walls of their shared tent, once a shelter, had transformed into the lining of a stomach digesting them slowly. The air inside was thick, a humid miasma of unwashed wool, stale tobacco, and the sickly sweet copper scent of decaying breath. It clung to the back of Ada's throat, a taste that no amount of melted snow water could wash away. She knelt beside Knight, her knees aching against the hard-packed dirt floor. He lay tangled in his sleeping bag, a man who had once hauled sledges with the vigor of a draft horse, now reduced to a trembling heap of fevered rag. Ada pulled back the cuff of his woolen undershirt. His skin, usually pale and ruddy with exertion, had taken on the translucent quality of parchment. Beneath the surface, dark, amorphous shapes spread like spilled ink, bruises that appeared without impact, hemorrhages blossoming from failing capillaries. It was the black blood, rising to the surface as if the body were rejecting its own life force. Night groaned, a wet, rattling sound that vibrated deep in his chest. Ada dipped a rag into a bowl of tepid water and wiped his forehead. His skin felt doughy, retaining the impression of her fingers like wet clay. When he opened his mouth to speak, the sight made her stomach lurch. His gums had swollen over his teeth, turning a violent, spongy purple that looked ready to burst at the slightest touch. The connective tissue was dissolving, the very glue holding him together, undoing itself, one vitamin-starved cell at a time. He whispered of London, of warm rain and pavement, his mind fracturing under the pressure of the fever. She was hired to sew skins, to mend tears in parkas and mucklucks. Now, she was mending men who were beyond repair. Crawford sat by the stove, staring into the flickering flame with glassy, unseeing eyes. He held a tin of pilot bread, his hand shaking so violently the dry crackers rattled against the metal sides. The logic that had guided them here, the British stoicism, the scientific planning, was fraying. They snapped at each other over nothing, their tempers brittle, their voices thin and reedy. They spoke of the relief ship as if it were due tomorrow, refusing to acknowledge the calendar that mocked them from the tent pole. Ada left the suffocating warmth of the sickbay and pushed through the flap into the biting twilight. She needed to check the cache. The wooden crates were stacked 100 yards from the camp, buried under a protective layer of snow to keep the foxes at bay. She dug until her mittens scraped against rough timber. Prying the lid off the main provision box, she stared down into the crate, her breath catching in her throat. Her eyes counted the tins, then counted them again, the arithmetic of survival clicking coldly in her mind. They had been eating with the appetite of healthy men, but they were burning calories they did not possess. The crate was half empty. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the lethargy. She looked up from the box, scanning the horizon for the dark shapes of seals or the lumbering white silhouette of a bear. The landscape was a perfect, terrifying blankness. The ice pack had shifted days ago, closing the leads of open water, and with the water went the seals. The tracks she had seen last week were gone, buried under wind-driven drifts. The game had migrated, the food was disappearing, and inside the tent, the men were rotting from the inside out. Pause. The morning of January 28th did not break. It merely bruised the darkness into a lighter shade of gray. The decision had been calcified over nights of whispered arguments that Ada pretended not to hear, though the thin canvas walls offered no secrets. Crawford, Gale, and Moorer were leaving. They called it a rescue mission, a heroic trek across the frozen Chukchi Sea to Siberia to bring back help. But the air in the camp tasted of abandonment. They were strapping on their snowshoes with the grim efficiency of men preparing for the gallows, their movements jerky and devoid of hope, avoiding the corner of the tent where Knight lay rotting in his sleeping bag. Hostile environment. The landscape before them was a chaotic sculpture of pressure ridges and jumbled ice, a frozen ocean that looked less like a path and more like the shattered teeth of a giant. The wind coming off the pack ice didn't just chill. It possessed a physical weight, pressing against the chest and stealing the heat from the lungs before a breath could fully form. Ada stood by the tent flap, her hands tucked deep into her armpits to preserve the last vestiges of warmth, watching Mauer tighten the lashings on the sledge. The leather groaned under the tension, a dry, stretching sound that cut through the whistling wind, marking the finality of their preparations. There were no speeches, no grand declarations of British fortitude or promises of swift return. The shame was a palpable entity standing among them, vast and silent. Crawford wouldn't meet her eyes. He focused intensely on the tips of his muclucs, adjusting a binding that was already perfect, his breath pluming in jagged bursts of steam that crystallized instantly on his beard. They were taking the dogs, the good sled, and the bulk of the remaining strength, leaving her with a man whose scurvy-ridden legs could no longer bear the weight of his own skeleton. They were cutting off the necrotic limb to save the body, and she was the limb. The departure was an exercise in slow-motion agony. The men harnessed themselves to the sledge alongside the dogs, their bodies angled forward against the resistance of the snow. There was the scuff of wood on ice, the panting of the huskies, and then the rhythmic crunch of boots fading into the distance. They didn't look back. To look back would be to acknowledge the woman and the dying man they were sentencing to the silence. They simply walked into the white blur, their figures losing definition with every yard, transforming from men into dark smudges, and finally into nothing more than flaws in the horizon's vision. Inside the tent, Night let out a low, delirious moan, a sound that tethered Ada to the spot. The silence that rushed in to fill the space left by the three men was heavy, pressing against her eardrums until they rang with a high-pitched whine. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the presence of a void so absolute it felt predatory, a vacuum trying to suck the life out of the small clearing. She looked at the vast, indifferent expanse of the Arctic, realizing that the tether to the civilized world had just snapped. There was no captain, no leader, no scientist left to chart the course. The cold seeped through the soles of her boots, turning her toes into stones, but the chill in her chest was far deeper. She turned away from the empty horizon and faced the tent, the small, fragile triangle of canvas that was now the only thing separating her from eternity. The wind picked up, erasing the fresh tracks of the departed men within minutes, scrubbing the world clean of their existence and sealing her inside the white tomb. She was the master of the dead now. The world had contracted from the infinite white horizon to a radius of 6 feet, a suffocating sphere of canvas and stale air that smelled of sweet, cloying rot. The tent was no longer a shelter. It was an incubator for decay. For days, the concept of time dissolved into a rhythmic cycle of boiling water and wiping the fever sweat from Night's forehead, a ritual performed in a twilight gloom that never fully brightened. The sun was a rumor, a weak ghost beyond the heavy fabric, while inside, the reality was the stark, undeniable scent of a human body breaking down while the soul was still trapped within it. Ada moved with the economy of a miser, every motion calculated to preserve calories. She knelt beside the small stove, feeding it driftwood splinters she had shaved with a numb hand. The wood was precious, more valuable than gold or blood, and she rationed it with a ruthlessness born of terror. The fire was not there to warm the air, that was an impossible luxury, but merely to melt the snow into a tepid liquid that she could press to Night's cracked lips. The metal cup burned her fingertips, a sharp, biting pain that she welcomed because it was a sensation of life in a place dominated by the numbness of the dying. Night was a landscape of ruin. Scurvy had unmade him, reversing the knitting of his flesh, opening old scars and turning his gums into dark, swollen sponges. When she leaned in to sponge his face, the odor of gangrene assaulted her, a heavy, metallic musk that coated the back of her throat and made the simple act of breathing a battle against nausea. He looked at her with eyes that were glassy and unseeing, swimming in a delirium that mercifully separated him from the agony of his own disintegration. His skin was gray, pulled tight over the skull, translucent enough to show the blue veins mapping the fading geography of his life. The silence of the Arctic was usually a vast, crushing weight, but here it was kept at bay by the terrible, ragged sound of night's respiration. It was a wet, rattling noise, like air being forced through a broken reed. Ada sat cross-legged on the reindeer skins, her own breath misting in the frigid air, listening to the cadence of his struggle. Inhale. A pause that stretched too long. A shuddering exhale. It was the only clock she had left, a biological countdown ticking away the seconds of their shared isolation. She hated the sound, yet she dreaded the quiet that would inevitably follow it. Night fell, or rather, the gray gloom deepened into a suffocating blackness. The wind outside began to scour the canvas walls, a relentless abrasion that sounded like sandpaper on bone. Ada huddled closer to the dying man, not for warmth, but because the primitive part of her brain screamed that she was prey in a den of shadows. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, the movement becoming shallower, the pauses between breaths stretching into agonizing chasms of stillness. Then, there was no exhale. The tent was plunged into a silence so profound it felt violent. The wet rattle ceased, snapping the thin thread of noise that had tethered Ada to sanity. She leaned forward, placing a trembling hand over his mouth, waiting for the puff of air, the twitch of a muscle, anything to push back the void. Her palm felt nothing but the cooling stillness of flesh that had ceased to be a person and had become an object. The wind howled outside, tearing at the guy lines, but inside, the stillness was absolute. She pulled her hand back, curling it against her chest. The solitude hit her not as a thought, but as a physical blow to the stomach, knocking the wind from her lungs. The others were gone. Night was gone. The white tomb had finally claimed its first tenant, and she was the sole witness, trapped in the dark with a corpse that was already freezing solid. Grief was a luxury that the Arctic did not permit. With the cessation of Night's breathing, the equation of survival shifted instantly from nursing a companion to disposing of a biological hazard. In the sub-zero temperatures, the body would not rot immediately, but it would freeze into an unmanageable monolith, and worse, it would become a beacon. The scent of death, even frozen, traveled across the ice pack like a dinner bell ringing in a void. Ada knew she could not dig. The ground beneath the snow was permafrost, a slab of earth as hard and unyielding as cast iron. A shovel would only shatter against it, sending vibrations of failure up her arms. She had to build a tomb above the ground. Dragging Night from the tent was a grotesque test of physics. He was dead weight in the truest sense, his limbs already stiffening into the final geometry of his suffering. Ada looped a canvas strap under his arms and hauled him backward, her boots slipping on the rimed floor. Outside, the air was a physical assault, a wall of needle-sharp cold that instantly froze the sweat on her brow. She dragged him toward the supply cache, a chaotic pile of wooden crates 50 yards from the tent, leaving a shallow furrow in the snow that the wind began to erase the moment she passed. She positioned him between two stacks of heavy provisions, then turned her attention to the barricade. She needed to wall him in, to stack heavy wooden cases of tinned meat and biscuits around him to keep the scavengers at bay. It was an act of desperate architecture. Her muscles, wasted by months of rationing and atrophy, screamed in protest as she gripped the first crate. The wood was rough, splintering into her mittens, and the box was frozen to the ice below, requiring a violent jerking motion to dislodge it. Ada lifted the crate, her breath hissing through clenched teeth. She swung it atop the first stack, the momentum carrying her thin frame forward. Then she reached for a second box, a heavy case of condensed milk. She bent her knees, gripped the handles, and heaved. Her spine rebelled. There was no sound, only a sickening wet pop deep within her lower back, followed instantly by a sensation that felt less like pain and more like a lightning strike. The muscles in her lumbar region seized into a rock-hard knot, severing the connection between her will and her legs. The crate slipped from her numb fingers, crashing into the snow, and Ada collapsed. The agony was blinding, a white-hot paralysis that pinned her to the ice. She gasped, but the cold air felt like broken glass in her lungs. For a long minute, she lay face down in the snow, the world narrowing to the throbbing epicenter of her injury. In isolation, a strained back was not an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence. Mobility was heat. Mobility was life. She could not finish the wall. Night lay half exposed, a gray shape against the white, but she could do nothing for him now. The crawlback. The retreat to the tent was a humiliating, terrifying crawl. Ada dragged herself through the snow using her elbows, her legs trailing uselessly behind her, every inch of movement sending shockwaves of nausea through her stomach. It took an hour to cross the 50 yards. By the time she rolled through the tent flap and collapsed onto her sleeping skins, her core temperature had plummeted. She lay shivering, unable to reach the stove, unable to undress, trapped in a prison of her own broken biology. Darkness returned, absolute and suffocating. The pain came in waves, pulsing in time with her heart, keeping her on the razor's edge of consciousness. She stared up at the invisible ceiling of the tent, listening to the wind die down. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Then, she heard it. It was a scuffing sound, distinct and deliberate. Rough pads testing the friction of the snow. It was not the chaotic rattle of the wind. It was the rhythmic, purposeful movement of a living thing. Ada stopped breathing, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The sound moved from the supply cache, where Night lay, toward her tent. The creature had investigated the dead, found it inaccessible, or perhaps suspicious, and had followed the fresh drag marks of the living. Closer. The scratching started low on the canvas wall, inches from where her head lay. Nails, thick and blunt, dragged across the fabric, testing the tensile strength of the only barrier between Ada and the tundra. The material bowed inward, tracing the shape of a massive snout pressing against the nylon. She could smell it now, a rank, musky odor of wet fur and old blood that permeated the thin wall. The scratching stopped, replaced by a sound that froze the blood in her veins. It was the heavy, wet huff of breathing, right beside her ear. The fabric of the tent was no longer a wall. It was a membrane, terrifyingly thin, separating a fragile biology from an apex predator that had evolved to dismantle it. The heavy, wet huffing against the nylon ceased, but the presence remained. A gravitational pull of sheer mass that seemed to suck the air out of the confined space. Ada lay frozen, her spine a rod of fused agony, listening to the crunch of compacted snow as the beast circled her shelter. This was not the chaotic frenzy of a wolf pack or the erratic curiosity of a fox. This was the deliberate, heavy-footed pacing of a king inspecting a nuisance within his domain. The smell arrived before the sound returned, a dense, oily stench of rancid seal fat and wet fur that clotted in the back of her throat. Ada forced her right hand to move. It was a microscopic action, a trembling slide of fingers across the sleeping bag, searching for the cold steel of the Lee Enfield rifle. Every millimeter sent a spasm of white-hot protest through her lumbar muscles, threatening to make her gasp, but she bit down on her lip until she tasted copper. To make a sound now was to invite the charge. The rifle lay propped against a crate of lantern fuel, its stock icy to the touch. She gripped it, her knuckles bleaching white, and dragged the weapon across her chest. The metal burned her skin with a cold so intense it felt like fire. a heavy, unwieldy tool that she barely understood how to wield. Outside, the investigation shifted. The rhythmic crunching moved away from the tent and toward the supply cache where she had abandoned Night. A terrible, splintering crash echoed through the stillness. It was the sound of seasoned wood shattering under immense pressure. The bear was not merely scavenging, it was dismantling her future. Ada listened in helpless horror as the creature tore into the crates she had failed to secure. Tins of pemmican were likely being crushed like aluminum foil, the precious calories spilling into the snow to be licked up by a rough tongue. The intelligence of the animal was palpable. It knew the difference between the dead, the food, and the living. It was systematically eliminating her resources before turning its attention back to the main course. Then, the silence returned, heavier than before. There was no warning growl, no roar of cinematic fury. There was only the sudden, violent depression of the tent ceiling as a massive weight tested the frame. The aluminum poles groaned, bowing inward under hundreds of pounds of muscle. A shadow, vast and indistinct, blotted out the faint ambient light filtering through the canvas. Ada maneuvered the rifle barrel upward, her elbows digging into the mat, the sights dancing wildly in the dark. She flicked the safety off, the metallic click sounding like a thunderclap in the small space. The tent wall to her left disintegrated. It didn't tear, it exploded inward, shredded by 5-inch claws that looked like obsidian daggers. A massive white head pushed through the ruin of the nylon, filling the tent with the vapor of its breath and the overwhelming stench of raw meat. Small black eyes locked onto hers, devoid of malice, filled only with a terrifying, calculating curiosity. The shot. Ada pulled the trigger. The explosion happened inside her skull. The muzzle flash was a blinding supernova that scoured her retinas, erasing the world in a wash of white light. The recoil was a mule kick to her shoulder, driving her broken body backward into the hard ice, jarring her spine with enough force to wring a scream from her throat that she couldn't even hear over the ringing in her ears. Smoke filled the small space, acrid and choking. Ada lay paralyzed, blind and deafened, the rifle slipping from her numb fingers. She stared into the swirling gray haze, waiting for the teeth, waiting for the weight to crush her chest. Nothing moved. The wind whistled through the shredded wall, carrying the silence of the grave. The silence that followed the bear's departure was not peaceful. It was a vacuum that sucked the remaining hope from the landscape. The creature had not died, but the flash and the thunder of the rifle had been enough to turn its curiosity into caution. It left behind a wreckage of splintered wood and torn metal, a chaotic testament to the violence of its hunger. Ada crawled through the debris of the supply cache, her hands numb and clumsy as she sifted through the snow, searching for anything the beast might have missed. There was nothing but flattened tin and the smear of pemmican paste ground into the ice. The bear had not just taken her food, it had taken her time. 2 days later, the hunger pangs ceased. This was the most terrifying phase of all. The gnawing, cramping emptiness that had defined the first week vanished, replaced by a cold, narcotic clarity. Ada understood the physiology of what was happening. Her body had stopped asking for fuel and had begun the grim work of harvesting itself. She could feel the metabolic shift as her system turned inward, stripping the fat from her kidneys and the protein from her muscles to keep the furnace of her heart burning. She felt lighter, untethered for the earth, moving with a ghostly drift that masked the fact that she was slowly dying. She looked at the spare pair of mucklucks in the corner of the tent. They were made of cured sealskin, stiff with age and stained with the grease of previous expeditions. Preparation was a fugue state of desperate industry. She sliced the tough leather into strips with her knife, the blade dulling against the hide, and dropped them into the pot of melting snow. The water boiled for 3 hours, turning a murky, opaque gray as the tannins, dirt, and ancient oils leached out of the skin. The smell that filled the tent was not of food, but of a wet dog and industrial chemicals. When she lifted a strip to her mouth, it was a slimy, gray slug that resisted her teeth. It had the texture of boiled tire rubber, forcing her to gnaw endlessly until her jaw ached. She swallowed the chunks whole, the taste of rancid oil coating her throat, a mockery of sustenance that sat heavy and indigestible in her gut. The soup provided no energy, only a false sense of fullness that quickly curdled into nausea. Driven by a frantic need to correct the mistake, Ada forced herself outside. She took the rifle, but the weapon felt like a lead pipe in her hands. The horizon swam before her eyes, the white snow and gray sky merging into a single dizzying plain. She wasn't hunting, she was wandering, a sleepwalker stumbling through a graveyard of ice. She found the nest on a windswept ledge of shale, tucked behind a barrier of rock that had shielded it from the wind but not the frost. There were 3 eggs, large and speckled, likely left by a glaucous gull seasons ago. Logic dictated that they were rotten, frozen tombs of bacteria that had been gestating in the cold for months. But the starvation logic whispered a different truth, overriding the warnings of her frontal cortex. To her starving eyes, they looked like polished gems. She cracked the first one against the stone. The shell gave way with a wet squelch rather than a snap. The contents were a slurry of black and viscous green, a partially developed embryo dissolved into a foul liquid. The smell hit her instantly, a punch of sulfur and decay that should have made her gag. Instead, she stared at the rot with a manic intensity. Her body screamed for protein, regardless of the source. With trembling fingers, she scooped the gelatinous mass into her mouth. It tasted of ammonia and death, a burning chemical foulness that coated her tongue and scorched her esophagus. She ate the second one before the reality of the first could register. Rejection. The reaction was almost immediate. Her stomach, dormant and shrunken, rebelled with catastrophic violence. A wave of heat surged from her core, followed by a spasm that doubled her over in the snow. She retched, her body heaving in dry, agonizing convulsions before purging the toxic slurry, along with the precious water and bile she could not afford to lose. The vomiting went on until she was dry heaving against the ice, gasping for air that felt too thin to breathe. She collapsed onto her side, the cold seeping instantly through her parka. The clarity was gone, replaced by a dark, heavy curtain falling over her mind. She closed her eyes, the taste of sulfur lingering in her mouth, and waited for the cold to finish what the bear had started. The solitude had acquired a texture, a heavy velvet drape that smothered the panic of the previous days and replaced it with a sedated, domestic tranquility. The tent, once a claustrophobic coffin of flapping nylon, had expanded in her mind, transforming into a parlor of warm memories. Ada sat cross-legged on her sleeping bag, the stench of her own sickness forgotten, watching the 3 men who had abandoned her months ago. They sat in a semicircle around the unlit stove, their faces unmarred by frostbite, their eyes bright with a camaraderie that had never actually existed. Miller was there, cleaning his glasses with a phantom cloth. The captain leaned back against a crate of supplies that she had burned weeks ago. She felt a surge of hospitality, a desperate need to be a gracious host in this frozen wasteland. With hands that trembled from a joy that was chemically indistinguishable from madness, Ada reached for the pressure stove. She didn't check the fuel gauge. The weight of the canister was irrelevant in the face of company. She struck a match, the sulfur flare blinding in the dim light, and ignited the burner. The roar of the blue flame was a conversation starter, filling the silence that the ghosts refused to break. She scooped precious snow into the pot, wasting BTUs to boil water for men who were likely dead or hundreds of miles away. She sprinkled the last dust of tea leaves into the water, watching the dark swirls infuse the liquid, preparing a service for mouths that could not drink. "It's almost ready," she whispered, her voice a raspy croak that sounded like grinding stones. She laughed then, a dry, cracking sound, responding to a joke Miller hadn't told. The logic of survival, the ruthless arithmetic of calories and kerosene had been deleted. In its place was a theater of the mind, projecting comfort onto the canvas of her misery. She poured the tea into a tin cup and held it out to the empty air, her arms shaking as she waited for a hand that would never take it. When no one moved, she didn't despair. Her attention simply drifted, pulled by a new spectacle shimmering through the open flap of the tent. Out on the ice, the world had changed. The horizon was no longer a flat line of death. It was a skyline. The interplay of moonlight and suspended ice crystals, diamond dust, had constructed a shimmering metropolis in the distance. She saw towering spires of glass and light, the warm glow of street lamps, the inviting pulse of a living city. It was beautiful, and it was waiting for her. She left the tea steaming on the floor of the tent, the stove still roaring and wasting the last of her fuel, and crawled out into the night. She stood without her gloves. The air was 40 degrees below zero, but to her confused nerve endings, it felt like a spring breeze. She began to walk, her gait stumbling but purposeful, drawn like a moth to the imaginary incandescence. The snow crunched rhythmically under her boots, a hypnotic metronome that synchronized with her slowing heart. She walked for 10 minutes, leaving the only shelter she had, convinced that salvation was just across the field of white. The city grew brighter, the lights dancing and refracting, urging her to take one more step. The ground vanished. It wasn't a stumble. It was a sudden absence of the world beneath her right foot. Her boot kicked into empty space, and her momentum carried her forward, her chest slamming onto the hard lip of the ice. The shock was instantaneous and violent. The impact knocked the wind out of her, shattering the hallucination into a million shards of cold reality. The city of lights blinked out, replaced by the desolate, moonlit tundra. Ada lay prone, her face pressed against the ice, her breath freezing instantly on her cheeks. Slowly, terrified of what she would find, she lifted her head and looked down. Inches from her nose, the glacier split open in a jagged, yawning mouth. It was a crevasse, a fracture in the ice sheet that dropped down into a darkness so profound it looked solid. She stared into the abyss, the walls glowing with a deep, prehistoric blue that faded into black infinity. She scrambled backward, clawing at the snow with frozen, ungloved fingers, kicking herself away from the edge until she was huddled in a ball 10 yards away. The tea was gone. The men were gone. The city was gone. There was only the wind screaming over the mouth of the pit, and the terrifying realization that the most dangerous thing on the ice was no longer the cold, but her own mind. The injury. The summer thaw did not bring warmth. It brought a wet, pervasive misery that soaked into the marrow of Ada's bones. The sun hung low and persistent, a bruised yoke that refused to set, dragging the temperature just high enough to turn the world into a purgatory of gray slush. The pristine, sterile silence of deep winter was gone, replaced by the relentless, grinding sound of shifting pack ice and the smell of ancient, rotting kelp released from its frozen tomb. Ada moved along the shoreline, her boots sinking into a mixture of black volcanic sand and half-melted sleet. The air was heavy with moisture, clinging to her skin like a damp shroud, a stark contrast to the dry, biting wind that had flayed her cheeks for months. She was lucid now, the hallucinations of the city burned away by her near-death experience at the crevasse, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. To survive the coming darkness, she needed access to the open water, to the seals that barked mockingly from the floating pans of ice just out of reach. She needed a raft. The beach was a graveyard of driftwood, massive trunks of pine and cedar, bleached white by salt and time, tossed up by violent storms decades ago. She selected a heavy timber, partially buried in the permafrost of the bank, its surface slick with algae and ice. Her body was a wreck of protruding bones and atrophied muscle, every movement a negotiation with exhaustion. She wedged a smaller, sturdy branch under the timber to act as a fulcrum, her mind working through the simple physics of leverage that her muscles could barely support. She leaned her entire body weight onto the makeshift lever, gritting her teeth as the mud sucked at her boots. The heavy log groaned, shifting an inch, then two, the suction of the frozen earth fighting to keep its prize. Sweat, hot and oily, ran down her spine, freezing instantly against the damp fabric of her undershirt. She pushed harder, desperation overriding caution, her vision tunneling on the shifting wood. The lever didn't warn her. It didn't bend or creak. It simply disintegrated under the strain, the rotten core giving way in an instant. Ada pitched forward, her balance lost to the sudden lack of resistance, just as the massive timber slammed back down into its cradle. Her right hand, caught in the follow-through of her fall, was still gripping the underside of the log. Agony. A sickening, wet crunch echoed across the empty beach. For a second, there was no pain, only a profound, vibrating numbness that traveled up her forearm to her shoulder. Then, the nervous system caught up. A scream tore from her throat, raw and animalistic, as a wave of white-hot agony exploded in her hand, blinding her to the gray sky and the black water. It wasn't the stinging cold of frostbite. It was the searing heat of destruction, a fire lighting up the nerves in a chaotic frenzy. She scrambled backward, dragging her crushed hand from beneath the wood, cradling it against her chest as she curled into the slush, hyperventilating against the shock. When she finally dared to look, the sight was a study in ruin. The hand was a shapeless mass of purple and red, the fingers swelling rapidly against the skin, twisted at unnatural angles that defied anatomy. There was no blood on the outside, which was worse. The bleeding was internal, a pressure cooker building beneath the dermis. The logic of the survivor kicked in, ruthless and cold, silencing the weeping child in her brain. If she didn't set the bones now, before the swelling hardened the tissue into concrete, she would never use the hand again. She dragged herself back to the supply crate, fumbling with her good left hand to tear strips from her shirt. She found 2 flat pieces of crate wood, rough with splinters. She placed her mangled hand on her knee. She didn't count to 3. She simply pulled. The sensation of bone grating against bone was a vibration that she felt in her teeth, a nausea that roiled her empty stomach. She bound the wood tight, screaming silently through clenched jaws until the world went dark at the edges. She sat alone in the gray slush, the ocean lapping at her boots, a cripple waiting for the winter to finish what the wood had started. Pain had become a localized weather system, a low-pressure front of throbbing heat anchored to the end of her right arm. The splinted limb hung uselessly in a sling of filthy rag, a dead weight that threw off her center of gravity with every step. But the agony was secondary to the rage. The silence of the tundra, once her only companion, had been colonized by a maddening, microscopic invasion. It started with the scratching, an incessant, frantic skittering behind the rock walls of her shelter that vibrated through her skull when she tried to sleep. The thaw had woken the world, and the world was starving. Ada pulled back the heavy slate slab covering her meager food cache, her good left hand trembling with a mixture of weakness and anticipation. The smell hit her first. Not the clean scent of cured meat, but the musk of urine and the stale odor of wet fur. Her dried venison, the lifeline meant to carry her through the next month, was a ruin of gnawed edges and scattered crumbs. A horde of lemmings, driven by the frantic biological imperative to breed and eat, had tunneled through the moss packing. They were stealing her life, calorie by calorie. This was no longer a battle against the elements. It was a war of attrition against 1,000 tiny mouths. She could not hunt. The recoil of a rifle would shatter her unknit bones, and she lacked the dexterity to draw a bow even if she had one. She had to regress, to devolve into something older and crueler. She spent the daylight hours constructing deadfalls, a primitive engineering task made excruciating by her disability. She dragged flat, heavy stones from the creek bed, using her knees and her teeth to manipulate the trigger sticks. Every calorie expended in lifting a rock had to be calculated against the potential return of a few ounces of rodent meat. It was a math equation written in sweat and bile. Then came the fox. It was a bold, ragged creature, its coat patchy with shedding winter fur, its eyes bright with the same desperate hunger that hollowed Ada's stomach. It raided the deadfalls before she could reach them, stealing the crushed lemmings from under the stones. It was a parasite feeding on a parasite. Ada watched it from the darkness of her shelter, her heart hammering a slow, predatory rhythm. She used her last length of braided sinew to rig a snare at the bottleneck of the game trail, a loop of tension waiting for a mistake. The kill. The sound woke her 2 nights later. It wasn't a roar, but a chaotic thrashing against the scrub brush, accompanied by high-pitched, yipping screams that sounded unnervingly like a human infant. Ada emerged into the twilight, a rock in her good hand. The fox was entangled, the noose tightened around its midsection, biting deep into the soft belly fur. The animal snapped at her, teeth flashing white in the gloom, twisting its body in impossible contortions to escape. There was no nobility in this kill. She brought the rock down with a grim, mechanical efficiency, silencing the screams with a dull, wet thud that vibrated up her arm. Processing the carcass was a descent into madness. Without an opposing thumb to hold the hide taut, skinning the animal became a wrestling match with cooling flesh. She pinned the fox to the ground with her boot, slicing upward with the knife held in her left hand. The fascia clung stubbornly to the muscle, the knife slipping on the grease, slicing into the meat she couldn't afford to waste. Blood coated her fingers, turning the knife handle into a bar of soap. She wept, not from sadness, but from the sheer, grinding frustration of her own incompetence. She didn't gather wood. She didn't strike a spark. The energy required to build a fire was a luxury she could no longer afford. She carved a strip of dark, purple meat from the haunch and put it directly into her mouth. It was tough and stringy, tasting of copper and wild musk, the temperature of the flesh shocking against her tongue. She chewed rhythmically, her eyes staring blankly at the horizon where the gray sky met the gray earth. The civilized veneer had finally cracked completely. There was no Ada anymore, no pilot, no human woman. There was only the animal that ate and the animals that were eaten. The storm. The sky above the glacier did not darken with clouds. It curdled into a sickly, oscillating violet. The warning wasn't visual, but auditory, a low-frequency vibration that hummed through the bedrock and traveled up through the soles of Ada's boots, rattling her teeth and her gums. This was not the chaotic swirl of a blizzard, nor the stinging bite of a squall. It was a katabatic event, a river of gravity-driven air plummeting from the high ice sheet, gathering the weight of a freight train as it accelerated toward the sea. The first gust hit the island with the force of a physical blow, staggering her sideways against the rough-hewn wall of her shelter. There was no build-up, no crescendo. One moment, the air was still, and the next, the atmosphere had solidified into a weapon. The roof of her shack, a pitiful collage of driftwood and scavenged aluminum, did not flap or shudder. It simply vanished. The screaming wind caught the lip of the overhang and peeled the structure open like a tin of sardine, hurling the debris into the gray void beyond the cliffs. Ada threw herself to the dirt floor, curling into a fetal ball as the structural integrity of her home vaporized around her. She was exposed. Survival logic overrode the panic. Months ago, in a fit of paranoia that now seemed like prophecy, she had excavated a depression in the hard-packed earth behind the shack's foundation, a grave-sized trench lined with moss. She scrambled toward it on her belly, her broken arms screaming in protest as she dragged her weight through the dirt. The wind was so loud it ceased to be sound and became pressure, a crushing weight against her eardrums that threatened to liquefy her equilibrium. She rolled into the trench and grabbed the stiff, frozen tarp she kept anchored with heavy stones. Pulling the canvas over her body was like wrestling a living thing. The gale inflated the fabric, snapping it with enough violence to break fingers. But she clamped her good hand onto the edge and pinned it beneath her hip. The world contracted to a space 2 feet wide and 6 feet long. Darkness swallowed her, but it was a darkness filled with violence. Then the bombardment began. The wind was moving fast enough to lift the scree from the mountain slopes. It wasn't just air passing over her, it was a horizontal landslide. Thousands of pebbles, shards of slate, and chunks of ice hammered against the tarp. The noise was deafening, a continuous, thundering roar of impact that vibrated through her ribs and into her marrow. Every few seconds, a larger stone would strike a glancing blow against her thigh or shoulder, the force transmitting through the canvas to leave deep, blossoming bruises on her emaciated flesh. She could not sleep. She could not think. She could only exist. Hour after hour, the assault continued without a singular second of pause. The cold seeped up from the ground, bypassing the insulation of her clothes to settle in her joints. She urinated where she lay, the warmth fleeting and grotesque, because moving the tarp meant inviting the storm into her sanctuary. The human mind is not built for 48 hours of sensory overload. It requires silence to process time. Without it, the hours smeared into a single gray eternity of impact. Ada drifted away. The woman who had landed the plane, the woman who had set snares for foxes, dissolved into the frozen mud. She stopped calculating calories. She stopped worrying about the infection in her arm. Her breathing slowed to a reptilian rhythm, shallow and infrequent, conserving moisture and heat. She became indistinguishable from the rocks surrounding her, a static object enduring erosion. She was no longer a person waiting for rescue. She was a heartbeat buried in the ice. The cessation of the bombardment was not a relief. It was a vacuum. When the wind finally died, it didn't taper off. It simply vanished, leaving behind a silence so absolute that the rushing blood in Ada's ears sounded like a distant waterfall. She pushed the heavy, rock-laden canvas aside and rose from her grave trench, her joints popping like dry twigs. But the world she emerged into had been deleted. The horizon, the cliffs, the jagged peaks of the glacier, everything was gone. In their place sat a wall of impenetrable, suffocating vapor. This was not mist. This was a suspension of supercooled water droplets, a freezing fog so dense it felt solid against the skin. Ada stood up, swaying with a vertigo induced by the total lack of visual reference points. There were no shadows, no depth, no distinction between the sky and the ground. It was like standing inside a ping-pong ball. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper, a desperate, raspy thirst that clawed at the back of her tongue. The freshwater ice was only 200 yards to the east, a route she had walked 1,000 times. Trusting muscle memory over her useless eyes, she took a step into the white void. The moisture was insidious. Unlike the dry, violent wind of the storm, the fog was a silent assassin that coated everything in a layer of rime ice. Within minutes, condensation settled on the hairs of her caribou parka, instantly freezing into jagged crystals. The fur, which had been her lifeline against the biting air, began to soak up the ambient moisture before freezing solid. Her coat transformed from a garment into a suit of lead armor, the weight dragging at her shoulders, the stiffened hide cutting into her neck with every rotation of her head. She walked for 10 minutes. She should have hit the incline of the glacier. She hit nothing. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at her chest. She stopped and turned around, expecting to see the faint outline of her ruined camp, but there was only the swirling, indifferent gray. She had walked in a circle. The equilibrium of her inner ear, deprived of a horizon line, had betrayed her. She was adrift in a shoreless ocean of white, untethered from the earth. She stumbled forward again, faster this time, desperation making her movements erratic. Her heavy boots caught on an unseen obstruction, and she went down hard, her face slamming into something wooden and unforgiving. She wiped the ice from her lashes and looked down. It wasn't a piece of driftwood. It was the crate. The violent winds of the previous 48 hours had scoured away the cairn of stones she had painstakingly built months ago, exposing the makeshift coffin to the elements. The lid had been pried loose by the gale. Lying inside, perfectly preserved by the sub-zero temperatures, was Night. He did not look peaceful. The freezing process had retracted the skin around his mouth, pulling his lips back in a permanent skeletal snarl. His eyes were sunken craters of frost. Seeing him here, exposed and desecrated by the storm she had just survived, severed the last cable holding Ada's psyche together. The irony was too heavy to bear. She had wandered blindly through a white hell, only to be guided back to the only other human on the island. She didn't scream. She didn't scramble away. The fight drained out of her legs, replaced by a heavy, narcotic lethargy. The cold was no longer painful. It was a dull, throbbing weight that invited sleep. Ada slumped against the side of the wooden box, her shoulder pressing against the pine that held the dead man. The fog swirled closer, wrapping them both in a shroud of white silence. She drew her knees to her chest, the frozen fur of her parka cracking loudly, and closed her eyes. She would just rest for a moment. Just a moment. The resurrection. Death did not come as a thief, but as a seducer, warm and soft, promising an end to the shivering that rattled Ada's teeth in her skull. But the biological imperative is a cruel master, indifferent to the mind's desire for peace. Just as the darkness began to swallow her conscious thought, a violent, involuntary spasm seized her diaphragm, a hiccup of survival that jerked her body like a marionette on a wire. The movement shattered the layer of ice that had formed over her parka, the sound sharp and brittle in the dead air. Pain, excruciating and immediate, flooded back into her extremities as her heart kicked a sludge of cold blood through constricted veins. She was not dead. Ada rolled away from the wooden crate, her limbs responding with the sluggish defiance of rusted machinery. She could not trust her eyes in the lingering gloom, so she trusted the earth. Stripping the mittens from her hands, she pressed her raw, blackened fingers into the permafrost, searching for the scars she had carved into this island over the last 2 years. Her fingertips found it, a shallow, frozen rut worn into the dirt by her daily trudge between the tent and the lookout. It was a lifeline of negative space. She crawled. For an hour, she was a 4-legged creature, dragging her weight through the snow, her head hanging low, following the track by touch alone. When her hand finally struck the canvas wall of the tent, she did not feel relief. She felt a grim, mechanical satisfaction. She clawed through the flap and collapsed inside. The air here was stale, smelling of unwashed bodies and kerosene, but it was still. Her hand brushed against something hard in the corner, a forgotten tin box pushed behind a crate of ammunition months ago. She pried the lid open with teeth that felt loose in her gums. Inside sat 3 biscuits, spotted with green mold and hard as slate. She shoved one into her mouth, the dry powder coating her tongue, the mold tasting of wet basements and decay. To her starving body, it was sweeter than honey. The carbohydrates hit her bloodstream with the force of a narcotic, igniting a small, fierce flame in the center of her chest. She was not done. She was not leaving. The predator returns. Ada reached for the rifle. The weapon was covered in a rime of frost, the bolt action stiff and unyielding. She spent the next hour stripping it down, her movements slow but possessed by a religious fervor. She wiped the firing pin, greased the bolt with the last dregs of oil, and worked the action until it slid with a lethal, oily silence. The fog outside had begun to lift, shredded by a shifting wind, revealing the jagged coastline. Down on the pack ice, a dark, slug-like shape lay motionless near a breathing hole. She moved out of the tent, no longer stumbling, but stalking. She positioned herself behind a ridge of snow, lying prone on the ice, the rifle stock pressed against her bruised shoulder. The cold seeped up through her stomach, threatening to steal the heat the biscuits had provided, but she turned herself into stone. She slowed her breathing. She slowed her heart. For 2 hours, she did not blink, did not shift, did not exist as anything other than an extension of the iron sights. The seal raised its head, slick and black against the blinding white. She squeezed the trigger. The report cracked the silence like a whip, a flat, ugly sound that rolled off the glacier walls. The seal slumped instantly, a single spasm of its tail, the only sign it had ever lived. Ada did not run. She walked with a terrifying calm toward the kill. The bullet had struck true. A pool of crimson was already spreading, melting the snow into a slush of vivid, steaming pink. She dropped to her knees. She did not wait for a fire. She cut a strip of dark, purple meat from the flank, the steam rising into the freezing air, and put it into her mouth. It was hot, metallic, and tasted of iron and life. As the warm blood ran down her chin, staining the white fur of her parka, the predator in her brain finally settled. She had resurrected herself from the tomb of the fog to reclaim her place at the top of the food chain. The wind off the Chukchi Sea carried the taste of ozone and impending snow, a bitter reminder that August in the Arctic was merely a polite fiction. Ada stood on the highest ridge of the island, her boots fused to the permafrost, scanning the gray expanse of the ocean with eyes that had forgotten the color of trees. 2 years had eroded the softness from her face, leaving behind a mask of wind-burned leather and cracked lips. The isolation was no longer a circumstance. It was a physical weight, a heavy blanket of silence that pressed against her eardrums until they hummed with phantom noises. The wind off the Chukchi Sea carried the taste of ozone and impending snow, a bitter reminder that August in the Arctic was merely a polite fiction. Ada stood on the highest ridge of the island, her boots fused to the permafrost, scanning the gray expanse of the ocean with eyes that had forgotten the color of trees. 2 years had eroded the softness from her face, leaving behind a mask of wind-burned leather and cracked lips. The isolation was no longer a circumstance. It was a physical weight, a heavy blanket of silence that pressed against her eardrums until they hummed with phantom noises. The wind. Then, the geometry of the world shifted. On the jagged line where the gray water met the white sky, a shape emerged that defied the chaotic logic of nature. It was not the undulating curve of a whale or the jagged spike of an iceberg. It was rigid, angular, and black. A smokestack, a hull. The silhouette of a steamship cut a hard, unnatural line against the chaotic backdrop of the ice pack. Ada blinked, certain that her starving mind was finally projecting its desperate desires onto the canvas of the world. But the shape remained. It was moving, plowing through the slush with a mechanical determination that sent a jolt of electricity down her spine. But the Arctic is a jealous warden. From the north, a bank of fog rolled in like a slow-motion avalanche, a wall of erasing white that threatened to swallow the ship whole. Panic, cold and sharp as a knife, severed her paralysis. She had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the visual link was severed. She did not run. She scrambled with the frantic, clumsy energy of a woman betting her life on a single hand of cards. She threw herself at the remains of her camp, tearing at the canvas of the tent she had so carefully patched for 24 months. She was destroying her home to build a beacon. Ada dragged the collapsed tent, the splintered remains of the ammunition crates, and even her spare furs into a chaotic pile on the ridge. Her hands shook so violently she could barely strike the match. The wood was damp, saturated by the eternal humidity of the thaw, and for a terrifying moment, the flame sputtered and died in the wind. She shielded the next match with her body, feeding it the driest moss she possessed, blowing on the ember until her lungs burned. The fire caught, not with a roar, but with a hiss of protest, consuming the damp wood and oil-soaked canvas. Thick, black smoke billowed upward. It was an oily, toxic plume that stained the pristine air, a dark smudge rising desperate and high against the blinding white of the glacier. Ada grabbed a pole with a tattered remnant of her blouse tied to the end and began to wave it. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly by the vast indifference of the ocean. Her voice cracked, tearing her throat, a raw and animalistic sound that carried all the agony of 730 days of solitude. The ship began to turn. Ada froze, the flag drooping in her hand. The bow of the vessel was swinging away from the island, angling back toward the open sea. The despair that hit her was not emotional, it was physical, a blow to the solar plexus that dropped her to her knees in the slush. They hadn't seen her. The smoke was lost in the backdrop of the coming storm. She watched the stern of the ship present itself, a final gesture of abandonment. She did not breathe. Then the vessel completed its arc. It had not been turning away. It had been navigating around a massive shelf of pack ice that guarded the bay. The ship corrected its course, its bow pointing directly at the column of black smoke rising from her pyre. A sudden plume of white steam erupted from the ship's whistle, a sound she could not hear over the distance, but the visual confirmation was absolute. Activity swarmed on the deck, small dark shapes moving with purpose. They were lowering a boat. Then the rescue. The cutter sliced through the slush, the rhythmic chugging of its engine violating the sacred silence of the bay. Ada Blackjack did not run to meet the shoreline. She stood rooted in the gravel, her posture rigid, her fingers curled tight around the stock of the Winchester rifle that had become an extension of her own skeletal structure. The adrenaline that had fueled her signal fire had evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow clarity. She watched the strangers navigate the ice floes with the suspicion of a hunted animal, her eyes darting from their hands to their hips, calculating threats before her conscious mind could label them as saviors. The keel of the rescue boat ground against the pebbles with a harsh, tearing sound. 4 men spilled over the gunwales, their movements clumsy and loud in the stillness. They wore heavy wool coats that looked impossibly clean, their faces flushed with the easy health of men who had slept in warm bunks and eaten hot meals. They stopped dead when they saw her. Ada realized with a detached curiosity that they were terrified. She was a specter, draped in sealskins and caribou hide, her face a topography of frostbite scars and ingrained soot, standing over the charred remains of her own shelter like a guardian of the dead. One of the sailors stepped forward, his hands raised, speaking words that sounded like a forgotten language. She lowered the rifle slowly, the muscles in her shoulders screaming in protest at the surrender of vigilance. The man reached out to steady her, but his grip felt alien, the warmth of his palm burning against the cold leather of her skin. She did not lean into him. She allowed herself to be guided into the rocking boat, her movements stiff and mechanical, her body obeying the physics of rescue while her spirit remained anchored to the permafrost. As the motor roared to life, churning the black water into a frothy white, she turned her head for one final look. The island was already receding into the mist. It looked small now, a gray tooth of rock jutting from the mouth of the ocean. Somewhere in that desolation lay the bones of night, the unburied ghosts of the others, and the woman she had been before the ice took her. She felt a sudden violent urge to leap back into the freezing water, to return to the brutality that made sense, rather than face a world that had forgotten her. The silence of the Arctic was not empty. It was heavy and absolute, and as the distance grew, she felt it tearing away from her chest like a scab being ripped from a wound.
The wind,
Civilization.
the wind,
Alienation.
the
The
wind.
transition to the main ship was a blur of noise and vertigo. They brought her into the mess hall, a space that smelled of stale tobacco, diesel fumes, and roasting meat. The heat hit her like a physical blow, a suffocating blanket of dry, stagnant air that made her lungs seize. Walls closed in on all sides, pressing against her peripheral vision, trapping her in a box of steel and rivets. The vast, infinite horizon was gone, replaced by the claustrophobic architecture of civilization. A plate was placed before her. Steam rose from the food, carrying the scent of onions and gravy, but Ada simply stared at the fork in her hand. It felt light, fragile, and useless compared to the skinning knife she had wielded for 2 years. The chatter of the crew died down as they watched her, their eyes filled with a pity she did not want, and a horror they could not hide. She sat motionless in the sweltering light of the electric bulb, listening to the hum of the ship's generator. It was a constant, droning noise that tried to mask the truth. But Ada knew better. She closed her eyes and found that the silence was still there, lodged deep in her marrow, a permanent glacier that no amount of warmth would ever thaw. She had survived the white hell, but she had not escaped it.